Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Honor of Kings. Um, I've been taking communion. I don't tell a lot of people, but I take it every day, sometimes more if needed, but you'll find that out in just a minute. So I started taking communion, and I use regular flour that does not have any baking soda or not all purpose, and definitely nothing that's self-rising, so it cannot have any yeast in it whatsoever. No baking soda, no baking powder, because both of those do have some yeast type of ingredients in there. So I've been taking communion with homemade bread and wine, and I'll put the homemade recipe down in the bottom. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the benefits of the covenant of communion, because that is a contractual transaction that happens, for the lack of a better term, and forgive me on trying to come up with a better term. But anyway, so there are benefits to this. The communion is actually a part of the contract. So let's move into it. So we go into what is communion. 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 26, and I put this in the New King James. This is Paul. Paul said, "For I have received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, 'Take this, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And in the same manner, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" So we're not limited in how often we take communion. Actually, I can tell you the body of Christ does not take it enough. Okay, verse 26, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes." Well, what's that mean? Let's start digging. Okay, continuing reading in 1 Corinthians 11. This starts in verse 27 through 32, and it's talking about preparing yourself, because this is a contract. When you go to get married, you don't just walk in and get married. You prepare it. You think about this beforehand. This is preparation. The same for when you go to do anything. Like if you go to buy a house, or you prepare, you look at houses, you talk to the banks, you could look at your credit scores. So you make preparations. So in the same way, and actually even more so, we should also prepare. So therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink the cup. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. For this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. For if we judge ourselves, we will not be judged. But when we are judged, we're chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world." So we're to be separate, and we're to really think about what we're doing when we're entering into this covenant contract through this act of communion, which is obedience. So let's go all the way back into Genesis chapter 14. And in Genesis chapter 14, 5 kings went and they kidnapped Lot and a couple other people out of Lot's household. And Abraham went with 318 of his servants that were raised and trained in his household. He went down, he fought the 5 kings, rescued Lot, and then he comes back. On his way back, Abram, because he wasn't Abraham at that point. He wasn't Abraham till later, a couple chapters away. So he met 2 kings. One was Melchizedek, and I hear some people say Melchizedek. Most of the Hebrew Jewish people I hear, they say Melchizedek. So I'm going to try to say what they say. And you know that my very thick Kentucky accent is there. So Melchizedek was the king of Salem, which was in Hebrews 7:1 and 2, they call him the king of peace and the king of righteousness. Then you have Bera, the king of Sodom. Need I say more? So what happened was, as Abraham was walking, let me back up, as Abraham was going back with his 318 soldiers, and he runs into these two kings, right? In this middle of this valley, Melchizedek brings bread and wine. It's right there in Genesis 14. Melchizedek brought out the bread and the wine. And so Abraham had two choices. On one hand, he has Bera, the king of Sodom, saying, "You owe me. Your people took stuff. We took care of you. You know, come on now. I've got stuff for you too." And Abraham looked, and then he's got Melchizedek, who brings covenant bread and wine. And Abraham chooses to worship and serve God. And he turns to Bera, the king of Sodom, and he says to you, "I am not serving you. I serve the Most High God. As a matter of fact, I'm not giving you anything. I don't owe you anything, and I'm not taking anything from you, not even the string from my shoelace." Look it up. And he made covenant with Melchizedek. And Melchizedek also blessed God. Now, what you have to remember is the only time two kings sat together for supper to eat is when they were making a treaty. Let's move on to Psalms 23, 5 and 6. The word says, "You," which is the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Psalms 23, 5 and 6. "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Now, Melchizedek prepared the table because he brought the wine and the bread. So there's a table prepared. So what happens to the enemy? Well, Colossians 2:15 said that Jesus, having spoiled the principalities and the powers — spoiled means he stripped them of everything that they had. He stripped them of their power. He stripped them of their authority. He stripped them of everything, all their rule, all their reign, everything. And having spoiled principalities and powers, Jesus made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Colossians 2:15. So if you look here at my lovely little enemies, they are dead and stripped completely of all rule and all authority, and they're running. So let's talk about Queen Esther and her husband. So what happened, I'm sitting last night, and I'm telling you, between 10 and 10:30 last night, I'm sitting there, and it just dawned on me of reading about Esther and what she had done, and I never linked the covenant or communion with her until last night, literally between 10 and 10:19. And it just clicked in my brain. I knew that it wasn't my thought. So let's talk about Queen Esther and her husband. So if you read the book of Queen Esther, King Ahasuerus had his first wife executed because she didn't obey, and he's a little hot-headed, and he's also a drunk. So what happens was they had a beauty pageant, and Esther she was queen because he fell in love with her. And the thing about it was, this guy Haman, some people say, so let's call him Haman. Haman had said, he didn't like Mordecai, and Mordecai was the uncle of Esther. He hated him so much that he sought for ways, because Mordecai would not bow to him. Haman was, like the best of the king. He was the second-hand man, and he thought everybody should bow to him because he's probably got to him. But Mordecai wouldn't do it. So because Mordecai wouldn't do it, Haman hated him. So if you read in Esther 3:6, "But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai, So he was going to have Mordecai killed, but then when he found out Mordecai was a Jew, then Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom. Said this is Persia. They were in a city in Persia. So he was going to kill all the whole kingdom of anybody who was a Jew, anybody that belonged to the people of Mordecai. So you have these two figures as well as Esther and her husband. So he hated the Jews so bad that he went to the king, and the king's like, yeah, whatever you want. He's probably hungover, but he's like, whatever you want. And he gave Haman the ring, and Haman made the decree that on the 13th day of Adar, which was the first month, the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month. So they had 11 months. So they were on the 13th day of the first month. And a decree was written according to all that Haman had commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to all the officials of the people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus. It is written and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all Jews, women, young, old, little children, women, in one day on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder all their possessions. So they were going to kill them all and then keep their stuff. So they had planned to spoil the Jews. So this was the plot. So it wasn't enough they wanted to kill Mordecai. He also then tricked the king into writing a decree to kill all Jews. So while all this happens, Mordecai he gets word out to Queen Esther, and she's like, well, I don't know what you want me to do about it. And he's like, girlfriend, do you think you're going to survive this? I mean, you're a Jew too, you know. What are you going to do when they find out you're a Jew? You're just as dead as the rest of them. This is the king's decree. There's no turning back. So she said, okay, I'm going to fast. You all fast for me, and I'm not really supposed to go before the king, but I will. If I die, I die. She said, if I perish, I perish. So Esther made a very bold move, and she fasted for several days, and then she approached the king, which she was legally not allowed to do, even if she was his wife. But she approached the king, and then when he saw her, his heart melted, and he called to her. And he's like, oh, what can I do for you? And she's like, I want a dinner with you and Haman, very sweetly. And so Esther answered at the dinner that night, or wait a minute, sorry, that day, she said, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared. Now, you got to remember, her husband's a drunk and Haman's wicked and full of pride. So what happened was he went to the very first banquet. And when Haman went to the very first banquet, he starts to head home. He sees Mordecai. Mordecai still didn't bow before him. Then he's really ticked. He just left the banquet with the queen and the king, but that's not good enough because one man didn't bow before him. So as he's walking home, he sees Mordecai. He gets all incensed if you read in chapter 5. And the wife said, his wife's name was Zeresh. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily to the king to the banquet. So the plan was, in between the first banquet that they had, the first sit-down meal, the first communion that they had together, that Esther said, I just want you to come back for tomorrow, and then we'll talk. And Haman got so mad because he saw Mordecai not bow before him that he forgot all about the banquet and was real worried about what Mordecai wasn't doing in his eyes. So his family was saying, just kill him and then go enjoy the banquet. So let's move on. That night, after the very first banquet, because there were two banquets that were held by Queen Esther, she took communion with the king twice. She ate with him. She supped with him twice. This was in between. This was after the first one, And it was that night he went to bed. And here was what happened, because this moment was very pivotal, very pivotal time. I cannot talk today. I don't know why. Okay. Esther 6:11 through 14. So Haman took the robe and the horse. I'm sorry. Let me back up just a second. The king went to sleep. He was starting to, and as he was starting to try to sleep, he couldn't. He couldn't stay awake. He was very restless. So he got up and he was reading all the chronicles of things that happened. And he was like, what happened? I mean, this man saved my life. Who is this guy? They're like, some guy named Mordecai. He's a Jew. And he's like, what? So the king is all excited. And he's like, I want to help this guy out. This guy really was good, man. He saved my life. There were two people plotting to kill me way back in Esther 2 and 3. They were going to kill me, but I was spared because Mordecai, man, he is my hero. He might have been drunk again. You never know. So anyway, about that time that Haman's coming back in the room, the king says to Haman, dude, what are you going to do with a man that the king just absolutely adores? And Haman thinks it's him, because he's that full of pride and he's that arrogant. He's like, what you need to do is put your robe on him, put his ring on him, and you need to run him all through the town talking about how great he is. And the king's like, perfect idea. That's what you, Haman, are going to do to Mordecai. So there's starting to be a little bit of humiliation here. This is that pivotal moment, that transition. It could have gone either way. So Haman was forced to take the king, took the robe and the horse to the king. He put the robe on Mordecai and he led him on horseback throughout the city square and proclaimed, thus shall be done to the man who the king delights to honor. And when it was all done, Mordecai went back to the gate and Haman got mad and went back to his house. And he's pouting and he's all upset. He told his wife Zeresh everything that had happened. And they're like, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. Then they realized, something's up. This is in that pivotal night after communion. Please remember, communion is important. So let's continue on. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came. Okay. Here we go. Banquet 2. Esther 7:3-6. Then Queen Esther sat before the king again, and he's like, okay, we're having supper, sweetheart. I love you very much, and I think you're beautiful and wonderful in every single way. But what do you need? And the Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, here we go, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated, completely removed off the face of the earth. We have been sold as male and female slaves. I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, who is he? And where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? Here we go. The hammer's about to drop. And Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Now, this is banquet 2. The first communion that they had together, husband and wife, and Haman was there. The enemy was still there. Same as the banquet back with, I've lost my train of thought, back with King Bera and back with Melchizedek. The wicked king was still right there. But you got to remember, God said he prepares the table before us in the presence of our enemies. He anoints our heads with oil. Our cup runs over. Okay, so here's our table before the presence of the enemies. Banquet 1, she just went and supped with him. Banquet 2, she petitioned him. Oh my. Oh my. Remember that pivotal moment? The king was couldn't sleep. And he started thinking, this reversed the enemy's plans. They ended up hanging Haman on the same gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Hello, Christians. The plans that the enemy has for you when you take communion with your king and you tell your king what is attacking you during that supper, during that communion, during that covenant moment, the plans of the enemy are reversed. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. But it got even better, because if you remember, they decided not only were they going to kill Mordecai, but they were going to kill all the Jews, just wipe them all out. Remember, annihilate all Jews. That's why she fasted. That's why Mordecai went to Esther to begin with. And he's like, I don't know what makes you think you're getting out of this one, sweetheart, but you're a Jew too. So if you read Esther 8:11, and you read the whole chapter 8, it talks about how that Mordecai and Esther set before the king, and he's like, it's signed, sealed, and delivered. I can't reverse this. So you all figure out how to get out of it. And Esther and Mordecai worked together. If you read it in chapter 8, they worked together, and then they said, okay, this is what we can do. We can't reverse and say, well, they can't attack us. However, we can defend ourselves, because the attack was already planned. All right. So it reversed what he was planning to do to kill Mordecai, but it gave the people, instead of being defenseless, the defense. It reversed the curse. They still had to fight. I have a dog moaning in her sleep. I'm sorry. Okay, so Esther 8:11. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together to protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. So now, instead of being a defenseless group of people who were supposed to be, destroyed, killed, and wiped off the face of the earth and robbed, they get to defend themselves and do to the enemy what the enemy planned to do to them. Oh, how the tables turned. Everything that happened, right, in the book of Esther, every plot against the Jews in the book of Esther. So you've got all these issues happening. Then there was the first communion that they had together, that very first night, in the presence of her enemies. She ate with her king. Then there was the pivotal moment. She had the second communion in the presence of her enemies with her king. And everything flipped. Are you being attacked by the enemy? Are you? Of course you are. So how often do we take communion? As much as you need it. As much as you need it. Take the unleavened bread. You can go buy matzo. That's fine. Go buy matzo if you can. If not, make your own. Take the wine. Sup with the Lord, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He is the Prince of Peace. This is Jesus Christ. He gave us all this information. First, if you can read 1 Corinthians 11, you can read it if you need to. Examine your heart as you're doing it, making sure that you're not doing this in pride, and make sure that you're not just ignoring and flipping through your phone or checking emails while in the middle of chewing. I mean, come on now. Do your time. Take your bread. Take your wine. How often do we take communion? As much as you need it. So here's what communion does. Communion recognizes and helps you choose the correct king. Don't choose Bera, the king of Sodom, even though he promised a lot of stuff. Abraham said, dude, I'm not even taking a string off your shoelace. No, not having it. That's in Genesis 14. You get to sit down with the king in peace, right? Because kings sat down to eat at the banquet to either make a covenant, keep a covenant, or remind everyone of the covenant that was there, right? Again, Genesis 14. This is his sacrifice, the Lord's sacrifice on the cross, his crucifixion, his body, his blood. 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 32 to learn how to do it properly. Colossians 2:15, it reminds the enemy of his defeat. He was stripped of all power and authority and made public humiliation. It reverses the curse, the plans that were put before you. So instead of being defenseless against your enemies, you can defend yourself and attack. That comes out of Esther 9 and 10. And it also restores us. If you go back, it's also in 1 Corinthians 11, 27 through 32. It tells you about how you're sick because you guys do things wrong. Because you don't take communion or you don't take it properly, you are sick. That's what happened. That's why you're dying. That's why you're ailing. But also if you look in Psalms 23, 5, and 6, right? He restores my soul. Right? He prepares the table before me in the presence of my enemies. He anoints my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So what does communion do? It does all of this. There is more to communion. There's more promises in communion than what we're told to just take it twice a year, maybe once a month, once a Sunday. Communion is pivotal for you to say, God, you and I are in covenant. The enemy's defeated. His plans are defeated. They're going to fall. Lord, you and I are in covenant. I am your child. I worship you. I love you. I serve you. Teach me your ways. What does covenant do? It restores me mentally, physically, spiritually. There you go. There you have it. On that note, just those minute little details, but all that information in Genesis 14, 1 Corinthians, Colossians 2:15, the book of Esther, that was a tricky one because I'm not going to say tricky, like manipulative tricky, but I wasn't expecting that. But last night, between 10 and 10:19, I can tell you when I read about those two banquets that she had and how the transition happened from totally against the Jews to for the Jews happened between the two communions that were taken. Take communion every day. I'm telling you, it is worth it. Take communion. Are you going to get fought? Yes, you will at first. But if you get fought, take it again, same day. And if you get fought more, take it again. James says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into diverse trials and temptations. And you know what? It gets almost silly, the things that happen throughout the day. You're like, really? I mean, seriously, stuff happens just so crazily that you're like, come on now. The enemy always overplays his hand. He always exposes what he's going to do, and God always gives us a heads up. That's what communion does. All right, be blessed. My brothers and sisters, I will see you next time on The Honor of Kings. Bye.